He spent 12 years shaping young minds. Yet in front of parents, the principal told him to stop teaching and start performing like entertainment. Laughter filled the room as they waited for him to play, mocking his worth. But when he picked up the violin, he didn't give them the show they expected. He gave them something that made the entire room go silent. What happened next, no one was ready for. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The late afternoon sunlight spilled through the tall windows of Jefferson Middle School's main office, casting uneven shadows across the tiled floor. The halls were quiet. Students had gone home, but the muffled hum of a copy machine and the faint scrape of janitorial brooms filled the silence. In his small corner office, Mr. Malcolm Wright, a black teacher with nearly 12 years of dedication behind him, was finishing his lesson plans for the next day. His desk was cluttered with stacks of student essays and a worn leather-bound notebook he carried everywhere. He was known among students as patient but firm, a man who demanded excellence while giving it back in equal measure. To the parents, he was respected for holding their children accountable, for encouraging not just grades but character. To his colleagues, though, his presence was a constant reminder, a black man who had worked twice as hard to earn half the recognition. That afternoon, the school's principal, Mr. Richard Calloway, appeared in Malcolm's doorway. Richard was tall, with silver hair combed back sharply, and the polished shoes of a man who wanted everyone to hear him coming. His tone always carried a hint of performance, even when he was only asking about schedules. "Malcolm," Richard said, lingering at the doorframe as though weighing how direct he should be. "Do you have a moment?" Malcolm looked up from his notes. "Of course, sir. Come in." Richard stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He didn't sit. Instead, he crossed his arms, letting silence build. That silence stretched just long enough to feel like a tactic, the kind that made subordinates fill it with nervous chatter. Malcolm didn't. He had learned long ago that quiet was sometimes its own form of armor. Finally, Richard spoke. "Tomorrow evening, we have the Parents' Association meeting. It's shaping up to be one of our largest turnouts this year. You know how these things go. Everyone expects a little polish, something memorable, a touch of flair." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, waiting. He knew Richard well enough to recognize when there was more to the pitch than the words presented. Richard's voice softened, almost as though he were trying to appear casual. "I was thinking, since you've mentioned your violin in passing before, you could play for them." The request landed with the sting of a slap. Malcolm blinked, his face unreadable. "Play the violin? At a parents' meeting?" "Yes," Richard replied smoothly, as if it were the most natural suggestion in the world. "It would be wonderful, uplifting even. Imagine it. The parents arrive. They sit down, and rather than listening to boring introductions, they get to see one of our very own teachers showing hidden talents. It's culture, Malcolm. Something refined. You know how much they'd appreciate that." The words hidden talents echoed in Malcolm's head. He was not an entertainer. He was not there to perform tricks for donors or parents looking to be charmed. He was an educator. His life's work was not a showpiece to fill awkward silences at parent gatherings. "Richard," Malcolm said carefully, his voice calm but heavy. "With respect, I'm not hired here to play music. I'm hired to teach. These parents are coming to discuss their children's education, not to see me perform." Richard's smile thinned, revealing the edge beneath. "Don't take it the wrong way. No one is questioning your teaching. It's just, think of the goodwill it would create. You know how parents talk, how they compare. If they see we have someone like you, someone with extra gifts, it makes the school look good. It makes me look good. And honestly, Malcolm, it makes you look good too." The pause after "someone like you" was razor sharp, deliberate or not. Malcolm felt it burn. He had heard variations of that phrase too many times in his life. Someone like you to mean black, to mean exceptional for the type, to mean useful only when performing for approval. He folded his hands slowly, forcing his tone to stay even. "Are you asking me or telling me?" Richard uncrossed his arms and placed them on the back of a chair, leaning forward with the ease of a man, confident in his power. "I'm strongly suggesting it. Let's be honest, Malcolm. Refusing would look uncooperative. You know how the board feels about teachers who don't go the extra mile." There it was, the threat wrapped in politeness. Malcolm's chest tightened. His years of degrees, late nights and sacrifices, were being reduced to a request to play background music, as though his true value lay not in his intellect or guidance, but in his ability to amuse. "Do any of the other teachers have to perform?" Malcolm asked, his voice sharper now. Richard chuckled lightly, waving a hand. "Of course not. This is different. You're unique, Malcolm. You should embrace it. Why be just another teacher when you could be unforgettable?" The word unforgettable dripped with condescension. Malcolm's jaw tightened. In that moment, he thought of his grandmother, who once told him stories of how black men and women were made to entertain, sing, dance, play music for white audiences who laughed, clapped, then went back to treating them as less than human. The image collided violently with the present. A modern school, a modern principal, but the same request dressed in new language. Malcolm stood, his height nearly matching Richard's. "I'll think about it," he said flatly. Richard's smile returned, this time triumphant, as though victory had already been secured. "Excellent. I knew you'd see it my way. Tomorrow night, then. Bring your violin." With that, Richard left the office, his polished shoes echoing down the hallway, until the sound faded. Malcolm remained standing, staring at the closed door. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with anger held too tightly inside. He sat back down slowly, pressing his palms against the desk. The violin case sat at home in the corner of his living room. Untouched for months, he had played it for joy, for solace, but never as a prop for someone else's agenda. That evening, as he drove home, the weight of the demand settled heavier with every mile. His modest apartment greeted him with quiet familiarity, the smell of old books and coffee lingering in the air. He set his briefcase down and sank into the armchair, staring across the room. There it was, the violin case, leaning against the bookshelf, like an old friend waiting to be acknowledged. He hadn't touched it in months. He had told a few students once, in passing, that he used to play seriously, that was all. Somehow, Richard had taken that fragment of his identity and twisted it into a stage act. Malcolm rose and walked to the case. His fingers hovered over the latch. Hesitant, he could hear his grandmother's voice again, warning him about dignity, about never letting anyone reduce him. At the same time, another voice whispered, "If you refuse, they'll brand you difficult. They'll say you're uncooperative. You know how that ends for teachers who look like you." He opened the case. The violin gleamed under the dim light, the wood polished, but marked by years of use. He lifted it carefully, the weight familiar in his hands, and rested it against his shoulder. He drew the bow across the strings once, producing a long, low note that filled the apartment. The sound was beautiful, haunting, but in Malcolm's chest it vibrated with conflict. Could he turn this demand into something else? Something more than what Richard expected? Could he take their attempt at humiliation and transform it into truth? As he stood in the middle of his living room, bow poised again, a thought began to form, a plan that was risky, unpredictable, and dangerous to his career, but impossible to ignore. He lifted the violin, set the bow to the strings, and in that moment he knew exactly what he would do at the parents' meeting. The night before the parents' meeting stretched long for Malcolm Wright. He didn't sleep much, not because he lacked the ability to rest, but because his thoughts ran circles around themselves, each loop tighter than the last. He sat at his kitchen table, stacks of essays pushed aside, the violin case open but untouched. His apartment, modest and filled with books, reflected the rhythm of a man who had chosen teaching not as a stepping stone, but as a calling. The walls bore framed photographs, not of luxury or travel, but of students. Over the years, grateful families had given him cards and small mementos. A drawing of a violin from a third grader. A thank you letter written in shaky cursive from a student who had struggled with reading until Malcolm spent extra evenings tutoring him. These pieces of paper, these tokens of effort and gratitude, meant more to him than any award. They were evidence of years spent pouring into young lives, brick by brick, lesson by lesson. Malcolm hadn't come to teaching easily. In college he had been torn between pursuing music, his first love, and education. But scholarships were scarce, and his family needed him to choose a path with stability. His grandmother had raised him after his parents' absence left him adrift, and her words had carried weight. "Baby, the world already sees you as less. Give them no reason to dismiss you. Teach. Shape minds. That's a legacy no one can take away." So he had chosen teaching, carrying his violin along like a secret companion, rather than a career. It wasn't that he had given up music. It was that he had chosen something greater. He wanted to be the kind of teacher he had rarely seen growing up. Someone who looked like him, who understood the coded comments, the lowered expectations, the constant need to prove and reprove worth. Over the years, Malcolm had built a reputation. He was the teacher who stayed after hours, who met struggling kids in the library when no one else would, who spent his own money on supplies when budgets failed. His paycheck was modest, but his dedication ran deep. Parents, at least those who saw the impact firsthand, admired him. Students often came back years later, remembering the lessons he had given about resilience more than algebra. Yet beneath that life of service lay an undercurrent that Malcolm could never fully silence, the knowledge that respect could be undone in a single gesture, a single insult, disguised as a compliment. The principal's request to play for the parents wasn't just tone deaf, it was erasure. It took all the years he had dedicated to being a professional educator and reduced them to the image of a man holding an instrument, performing to please. The next morning, Malcolm woke before dawn. He dressed neatly, as always, with crisp slacks and a tie that had seen many classrooms. He carried his briefcase, not the violin case, to school. Still, the thought of the evening loomed over him. By mid-morning, whispers had already begun. Teachers moved through the lounge with their mugs of coffee, their conversations half-muted but pointed. "I heard he's going to play something classical," one voice said with a smirk. No, another laughed. "I bet it's jazz. You know, something lively, something fitting. Either way, it'll be a nice break. Can you imagine? A little free concert with our meeting." Malcolm entered the lounge quietly, just in time to hear the tail end of that sentence. Conversations faltered. Smiles froze. A silence heavier than any greeting filled the air. Then, as if on cue, people shifted back into forced cheerfulness. "Morning, Malcolm," a teacher said too brightly. "Big night, huh?" He offered a polite nod, but his eyes gave nothing away. Inside, though, his chest tightened. Already the request had twisted into spectacle. He wasn't just a teacher anymore. He was the show. During his classes, Malcolm tried to push the thought aside. He taught his students with the same energy, the same patience, but even they seemed to buzz with curiosity. A few seventh graders lingered after class, whispering to one another before one finally asked, "Miss Wright, are you really going to play for all the parents tonight?" The question stung not because it was cruel, but because it revealed how quickly words spread, how quickly perception shifted. He was no longer just Mr. Wright, the teacher who cared. He was becoming Mr. Wright, the teacher with a violin act. That afternoon, he sat alone in his classroom. After dismissal, he looked at the rows of empty desks, the scrawled messages on the whiteboard, the sunlight slanting across the posters of black scientists, writers and leaders he had hung on the walls. He had always believed representation mattered. He wanted his students to see themselves in greatness, not just in stereotypes. And yet here he was, being pushed into a role that echoed a painful history, expected to entertain rather than to lead. His phone buzzed, a text from his grandmother's old number, still active, still in his contacts even though she had passed years ago. It was a scheduled reminder she had once set for him. "Never forget, baby, you're more than what they see. Hold your head high." The words brought a tightness to his throat. It was almost as though she knew this day would come, that one day he would be tested in exactly this way. Malcolm packed his bag slowly, carefully. This time he did take the violin case. Not because he had decided to comply, but because he was beginning to see the possibility of turning this insult into something greater. If they wanted a performance, maybe he would give them one, but on his own terms. As he locked his classroom, he passed by the lounge again. The laughter inside carried down the hall. He paused, his ear catching the words. "I heard he's nervous," one teacher whispered. "Can you blame him? Probably hasn't played in years. Imagine if he's terrible." Another chuckled. "What a disaster that would be." "Oh, come on. Even if he's decent at it, it's still odd, isn't it? I mean, since when does a math teacher double as the entertainment?" The comments sliced deep, but Malcolm kept walking, his face unreadable. He had learned long ago that dignity sometimes meant swallowing pain in silence, waiting for the right moment to release it. That evening, as he set the violin gently in his car, he thought of his students, their trust in him, their belief that he was more than the world often said he was. He thought of every late-night grading papers, every time he had fought for a child who others dismissed. And for the first time since Richard had made his demand, Malcolm smiled, not with joy, but with resolve. If they wanted to see him reduced to an act, they would instead witness something that could not be dismissed, something that demanded respect. But as he prepared to drive home, a text pinged his phone from an unknown number. He opened it. "Can't wait to see your little show tonight. Don't disappoint." No name, no context, just the words, sharp, mocking, laced with cruelty. Someone knew, someone was watching, and they weren't rooting for him. Malcolm stared at the screen, the glow reflecting in his tense eyes. Suddenly, the stakes felt higher. The performance wasn't just being anticipated, it was being set up, scrutinized, perhaps even sabotaged. He closed his phone slowly, his hand tightening on the steering wheel. Tomorrow night, it wouldn't just be about music, it would be about survival. The following morning, Jefferson Middle School buzzed with an energy that had little to do with academics. The parents' meeting was still hours away, yet the air was thick with speculation. The anonymous text Malcolm had received the night before clung to him like a shadow. He hadn't told anyone, but every conversation he overheard now seemed tinged with hidden meanings, every laugh sharper than it should have been. As he walked the halls, carrying both his briefcase and the violin case, eyes followed him. Students glanced at him with poorly disguised curiosity. A few whispered as he passed, their voices carrying just enough for him to catch fragments. "I heard Mr. Wright's doing a concert tonight." "No way. He's a math teacher." "Why would he play?" "My mom said the principal asked him to." "Like, as entertainment." "So he's not even a real teacher? Just like the music guy?" The words struck like blows. The students weren't cruel. They were repeating what they had heard at home, what adults had reduced him to in casual conversation. Still, the sting was real. Malcolm adjusted his grip on the violin case and kept walking, his face composed, but inside he felt the slow burn of humiliation spreading. In his first class, the tension only grew. Seventh graders are notoriously blunt, and today was no exception. As Malcolm wrote equations on the whiteboard, he could feel the undercurrent of chatter ripple behind him. Pens tapped on desks, papers rustled, snickers passed between rows. Finally, one student couldn't hold it in any longer. "Mr. Wright," a boy blurted out, his tone balancing between curiosity and mockery. "Are you really gonna, perform for the parents tonight? My dad said it's supposed to be some kind of show." The class erupted in laughter, though some students quickly looked guilty. Malcolm set the marker down slowly and turned, his expression calm but his jaw tight. "What I do tonight is not for discussion right now," he said evenly. "We are here to focus on math, not rumors." His voice was steady, but the air in the room shifted. The students fell silent, but their smirks lingered. To them it wasn't math class anymore. It was a countdown to the evening spectacle. During lunch, Malcolm sat in his classroom instead of the lounge, the violin case resting on his desk like an unspoken reminder of the choice before him. He tried grading essays, but the words blurred. He thought about his students' laughter, about the whispers in the hallway. It wasn't just about tonight anymore. It was about perception, about how quickly years of dedication could be overshadowed by one request, one performance, one evening framed as entertainment rather than education. Later that day, Malcolm overheard something that made his blood run cold. Passing by a cluster of 8th graders near the lockers, he caught a conversation midstream. "My brother said Mr. Wright's not even a real teacher. He's just here because he can play music. That's why the principal asked him, right? To show off." "Yeah, my mom said if he's good, maybe he should just stick to music and leave teaching to someone else." The boys laughed, shoving each other playfully, unaware of the weight their words carried. Malcolm froze for a moment, his chest tightening. To hear children, his own students, parroting adult prejudice cut deeper than any colleague's whisper. What began as a humiliating request was now reshaping his reputation in front of the very people he worked hardest for. That evening, he stayed late, preparing for the parents' meeting. The building grew quiet, as most teachers left, but Malcolm remained, staring at the violin case on his desk. The memory of the anonymous text still lingered. "Can't wait to see your little show tonight. Don't disappoint." At first he had thought it was from a staff member, but hearing the student's words made him wonder. Could it have been a parent? A colleague? Even a board member? Whoever it was, they wanted him reduced, diminished. They wanted to see him fail. As the sun dipped low, turning the classroom windows amber, Malcolm made a decision. He wouldn't back out. He wouldn't refuse. But neither would he give them exactly what they expected. If they wanted a performance, he would deliver one, but not for their amusement. He would make them listen, really listen, to something that could not be dismissed as spectacle. But the decision brought no peace. Walking to his car, violin in hand, he passed the teacher's lounge again. The door was cracked open, and inside he heard the laughter of two staff members who hadn't yet gone home. I bet he'll play something safe, maybe Amazing Grace. That would fit. Please, he'll probably try to go all fancy, like he's at Carnegie Hall. Honestly, it's embarrassing. I don't know why Calloway thought this was a good idea. Because it makes the school look cultured. And Malcolm's the perfect poster boy for that. Smart, musical, and, black. It checks all the boxes. Malcolm froze, his heart hammering. The casual cruelty of the words landed harder than any overt insult. He realized then that this wasn't just about one evening. It was about a system that saw him as useful only when he could be displayed, when his identity could serve someone else's agenda. He stepped away quietly before they could see him, but the words followed him all the way to the parking lot. For the first time since becoming a teacher, Malcolm wondered if his efforts were truly seen, or if he had simply been tolerated, kept in place until needed for moments like this. The night air was cool, but his thoughts burned. He placed the violin in the back seat, sat behind the wheel, and closed his eyes. He could hear his grandmother's voice again. Never let them decide your worth. Show them, but on your terms. He whispered to himself, almost like a vow. This won't be their show. It'll be mine. The next morning, the atmosphere at school was different. Electric, almost feverish. Students swarmed the halls with rumors spinning faster than fact. Some said he would play classical music. Others said jazz. A few whispered that he was so talented he might even be on television one day. But beneath the speculation lay a darker thread. He's not really a teacher, right? My cousin said the school just hired him for this. Yeah, my mom said he's probably only here because of diversity stuff. So tonight proves it. If he's good at music, that's what he should be doing. Not teaching us. The words tangled into Malcolm's consciousness like vines, wrapping tighter with every repetition. No matter how false, no matter how unfair, they carried weight, because they were spoken by the very people he had devoted his life to guiding. As he entered his classroom, ready to begin the day, he caught the unmistakable sound of his own students laughing. He paused just outside the door, listening. Inside, a group of boys were mimicking violin sounds, exaggerated and mocking. "Look, I'm Mr. Right," one said in a sing-song voice. "I'm not a teacher. I'm the entertainment." The class burst into laughter. Malcolm's hand froze on the doorknob. His chest tightened as he listened to the children he had stayed late for, fought for, now turning him into a joke. He had faced whispers before, but this cut at the very core of why he taught. Taking a breath, he pushed the door open. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by guilty silence. The students shifted in their seats, their eyes wide. Malcolm scanned the room, his face unreadable, but his eyes sharp with something they had never seen before. The violin case was still in his hand. He set it gently on the desk, his movements deliberate, controlled. The silence in the room deepened, until it was unbearable. And then, without a word, he looked directly at the boys who had mocked him. The school gymnasium had been transformed into a makeshift auditorium. Rows of metal chairs lined the polished floor, the sound of them scraping into place echoing against the high walls. A long table draped in the school's navy blue banner sat on the stage, reserved for the administration. A microphone stood at its center, the cord coiled like a snake across the floor. Parents filed in slowly, dressed in business suits, casual blazers, and weekend wear that still hinted at privilege. Their conversations blended into a low hum. Complaints about traffic, jokes about homework loads, speculation about new funding. But as more eyes wandered to the violin case resting on the edge of the stage, a new note entered the air. Anticipation. "Isn't that Mr. Wright's?" a mother whispered, nudging her friend. "I heard he's opening the meeting with a piece." Can you imagine? A math teacher playing violin. Well, that's unusual. But refreshing, I suppose. Something different. Better than another boring speech. The whispers swirled and grew, spilling through the gym like smoke. Some parents smiled, amused. Others looked skeptical, their brows furrowed as if the idea of a teacher crossing into art made him somehow less credible. On the stage, Principal Richard Calloway adjusted his tie and looked out at the gathering crowd, with satisfaction. He sat tall, hands clasped on the table before him, radiating authority. He had orchestrated the evening exactly as planned. An impressive turnout, a little cultural garnish to set the school apart, and himself at the center of it all. When Malcolm entered, carrying his violin. The room shifted. Heads turned. Conversations paused. For a moment he felt the weight of every eye, measuring him, expecting him to justify his presence not as an educator but as entertainment. He walked steadily to the stage, his expression calm, though inside the sting of the last few days pulsed like an open wound. Richard greeted him with a smile that was more command than kindness. "Right on time, Malcolm." "Perfect." Malcolm nodded, but said nothing. He set the violin case carefully on a chair near the podium, his movements deliberate, controlled. The meeting began with routine announcements, budget reports, facility updates, plans for upcoming field trips. Malcolm sat silently, his hands folded, listening as Richard droned on. The parents nodded along, some half listening, others whispering to their neighbors. Yet every so often, their eyes drifted back to the violin case, curiosity simmering. Finally, Richard cleared his throat and leaned into the microphone, his voice warm with rehearsed charm. "Before we proceed further, we have something special tonight. One of our own faculty members has graciously agreed to share a talent beyond the classroom. It's rare that we get to see such gifts, and I think you'll agree it makes Jefferson Middle a truly extraordinary place." A polite murmur of approval spread through the audience. Richard turned toward Malcolm, his smile tight with expectation. "Mr. Malcolm Wright, our dedicated math teacher, who, as you'll soon see, is also quite the violinist. Malcolm, the floor is yours." Applause followed, polite but tinged with curiosity. Malcolm rose slowly, carrying the violin case to the podium. He felt every step echo through his body. He opened the case with care, lifted the instrument, and adjusted it under his chin. The bow rested lightly in his right hand. For a moment, silence blanketed the gym. Parents leaned forward, expectant. Richard leaned back in his chair, arms folded, smug satisfaction painted across his face. To him, this was victory. His teacher reduced to a performer, his authority confirmed in every note that would follow. Malcolm raised the bow. His fingers hovered on the strings. His chest tightened with the weight of history, his own and generations before him. In that breathless pause, he heard his grandmother's voice again. "Never let them decide your worth. Show them, but on your terms." And then he lowered the bow. Gasps fluttered through the audience. Parents shifted, confused. Richard's smile faltered for the first time, his eyes narrowing. Malcolm set the violin gently on the podium. He rested both hands on either side of it, steady, unshaken. Then, in a voice clear and deliberate, he began to speak. "Before I play a single note, I want to say something." The room stilled. Every cough, every shuffle ceased. The gymnasium became a theater. Every parent suddenly an audience not for music, but for truth. "I've been a teacher here for 12 years. In that time, I've worked with hundreds of students. I've stayed late. I've tutored. I've given up weekends, not because I had to, but because I believe in the power of education. I believe in these children. I believe in what they can become." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. His eyes swept the room, locking briefly with faces that shifted uncomfortably.
Yet this week I was asked not to share my experience as an educator, not to talk about the challenges our children face, not to discuss what they need to succeed, but to perform.
Murmurs rippled. A father leaned to whisper to his wife. A mother frowned, glancing at Richard. Malcolm continued, his tone firm but controlled. "For some of you, this may seem harmless. Entertainment before business. A novelty. But for me, it carries a history. A history of being reduced. Of being told that my worth lies not in my mind. Not in my dedication, but in my ability to amuse." A stunned silence followed. Richard shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. He hadn't anticipated this. He leaned toward the microphone, as if to interrupt, but Malcolm's presence, tall, commanding, unyielding, held the room in place. "I love the violin," Malcolm said softly, almost to himself. "I've played since I was a child. Music has carried me through pain and joy alike. But when I bring this violin to you tonight, it will not be as entertainment. It will be as truth. It will be as a voice that cannot be silenced." The parents sat motionless, caught between discomfort and intrigue. Some lowered their eyes. Others stared at Malcolm as though seeing him for the first time. On the stage, Richard's face flushed with frustration. He tapped a pen against the table, but he dared not move further. The power in the room had shifted. Malcolm lifted the violin once more. The bow hovered again, poised, Parents leaned forward, expecting at last the music they had been promised. But instead, Malcolm did something none of them anticipated. He set the bow down, and then with steady eyes, he began to speak again. Not a lecture, not a defense, but a story. A story about his grandmother, about history, about dignity, about why he had chosen teaching over performance, and why every child in that room deserved to be seen as more than entertainment. The gym fell into silence so complete it was suffocating. Malcolm stood at the podium, violin resting against the wood, bow untouched. The silence in the gym was taut, stretched thin between curiosity and unease. Parents shifted in their seats, some impatient, some leaning in. The principal, Richard Calloway, tapped his fingers on the table with a forced smile, his confidence slipping. This wasn't the spectacle he had envisioned. Malcolm inhaled slowly, steadying himself. His voice emerged calm but resonant, filling the space like a note that refused to be ignored. I grew up in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce and expectations even lower. People didn't ask what you wanted to become. They assumed you wouldn't become much at all. My grandmother, who raised me, told me stories about her youth, about how in her time, black men and women were expected to sing, dance, and play music to entertain others, while their minds, their potential, their humanity were dismissed. She told me never to let anyone reduce me to a performance. The words hung heavy, each sentence landing like a chord vibrating against the walls. Parents who had come for an evening of polished updates and light diversion now found themselves held captive by something rawer, deeper. Malcolm continued. When I was a boy, I discovered the violin. It became my sanctuary. The bow and strings gave me a way to speak. When words failed, I practiced every day, sometimes until my fingers bled. Because in those notes, I felt free, not judged by the color of my skin, not reduced to stereotypes, just human. Music gave me a voice. He paused. The gym remained still, the air dense with expectation. But I chose teaching, he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. I chose to stand in classrooms instead of concert halls, because I knew children needed more than music. They needed someone to believe in them, someone who could look at them and say, "You are capable, you are worthy, you are more than what this world tells you." A murmur rippled through the audience, softer than before, more contemplative. A few parents exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that his words cut beyond personal biography into their own assumptions. Malcolm's voice strengthened. So when I was asked this week to perform, when I was told to bring my violin here tonight, it wasn't just a request. It was a reminder of how easily years of work can be erased, how quickly I can go from being Miss Right, the teacher who stays after hours, who tutors your children, who fights for their futures, to Mr. Right, the act, the novelty, the background music. The sting of his words reverberated in the silence. Some parents lowered their eyes, others straightened defensively, as if the mirror he held up was too sharp to look into. I am not here to entertain you, Malcolm said firmly. I am here to teach, to guide, to remind your children, and sometimes you, that education is not a performance, but a lifeline. That dignity is not optional, but essential. For a moment his voice softened again, almost tender. And yes, I will play tonight. Not for amusement, not for applause, but as a lesson. A reminder that behind every note, every bow stroke, there is a human story, one you cannot reduce to decoration. The room was spellbound. It was as though his words themselves had become music, measured, lyrical, resonant. The parents who had come expecting a pleasant diversion found themselves unsettled, confronted, even moved. Richard shifted in his chair, his face flushed. He hadn't expected this. He had wanted compliance, not defiance disguised as eloquence. Malcolm lifted the violin again, letting the silence stretch until it pressed against the audience. He placed the bow on the strings, ready to draw sound, but a voice cut through the stillness. Enough. A man in the second row stood, his suit immaculate, his expression sharp with irritation, his voice carried with the ease of someone used to being heard. All of this talk, all of this preaching, it's unnecessary. We came here to see if you can actually play, if you have the talent everyone whispers about. So stop the speech, play, prove it. Gasps fluttered across the gym. A woman tugged at his sleeve, whispering for him to sit, but he pulled his arm free, eyes locked on Malcolm with cold challenge. The words hit Malcolm like a slap. Prove it. As though his worth still required validation. As though his years of teaching, his sacrifices, his story meant nothing without entertainment. For a moment the room seemed to tilt. Parents held their breath. Students in the back seats fidgeted nervously. Even Richard, though pleased at the interruption, looked uneasy at the bluntness of the demand. Malcolm's hand tightened around the bow. His chest rose and fell once, slowly, deliberately. He looked out at the man, then at the sea of expectant faces around him. Every fiber of him wanted to stay silent, to let the man's arrogance echo into emptiness. But something stronger rose within him. The same fire his grandmother had spoken of. The same defiance that had carried him through every insult, every dismissal. He lowered the violin, his voice calm but cutting. "You want me to prove it?" he said. "Then listen carefully. Because what you hear next will not be proof for you. It will be truth for me." The man scoffed, folding his arms. "Then get on with it." Malcolm turned slightly, his eyes glancing toward the back of the gym, where the students sat. Their faces were wide-eyed, conflicted, caught between admiration and the whispers they had absorbed. He realized then that this moment wasn't just about parents or Richard, or even the mocking text. It was about them, about showing them that dignity could not be demanded away. He lifted the violin once more. The bow hovered in the air. The parents leaned forward, breathless, waiting. And then, in a gesture no one expected, Malcolm paused again. His bow froze inches from the strings. His gaze swept the room, locking onto the man who had interrupted him. "I will play," Malcolm said softly. "But understand this. Every note I play tonight carries history. It carries pain, resilience, survival. If all you hear is entertainment, then you have missed the point entirely." The man's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. The rest of the audience sat frozen. Malcolm drew the bow against the strings. The first note rang out, low and steady, filling the gym like a voice too powerful to be ignored. The bow touched the strings, and the first note spilled into the gymnasium. It wasn't timid or uncertain. It was rich, haunting, the kind of sound that made conversation impossible. The vibration hung in the air, and for the first time all evening, everybody in the room leaned forward, compelled by something they could not dismiss. Malcolm closed his eyes as he played, shutting out the watchful stares. He wasn't in the gym anymore. He was back in his grandmother's living room, the tiny space where he had first learned to play. He remembered the creak of her rocking chair, the smell of cornbread cooling on the stove, her voice telling him, "Don't just play notes, baby. Play true." His fingers moved with precision, but it wasn't perfection he sought. It was honesty, each note bent with feeling, carried by years of quiet endurance. The melody wasn't a famous concerto, or an easy hymn. It was raw improvised, a weaving of sorrow and resilience, echoing every humiliation he had swallowed, every long night spent grading papers while others questioned his worth. The parents sat frozen, their whispers silenced. Even the children in the back row, who had once mimicked him with mock violin sounds, now stared wide-eyed, unable to look away. This wasn't the novelty they expected. This was something else entirely. Richard Calloway's face stiffened. He had anticipated polite applause, a neat trick to impress parents, but what unfolded before him wasn't performance. It was power. Malcolm wasn't their entertainment. He was commanding the room, bending its attention toward a story no one had asked to hear but everyone suddenly needed to. The man who had demanded proof sat rigid in his seat, his arms still folded, but his eyes betrayed him. He tried to keep his expression cold, dismissive, but the music pierced through. Every sharp stroke of the bow cut through his arrogance, and every lingering note unsettled the certainty with which he had spoken. Malcolm shifted the melody, letting it swell into something larger, brighter. The gym seemed to expand with the sound. Parents forgot their impatience, forgot the mundane agenda of the evening. They were no longer in a school gym. They were in a concert hall, a cathedral, a space where walls didn't matter and time stood still. A mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. A father who had come with his phone ready to scroll through emails found himself clutching it uselessly in his lap. Even the restless children sat still, their fidgeting stilled by the gravity of the music. Malcolm's bow danced faster now, his fingers moving with speed that spoke not only of practice, but of something deeper. Years of silenced frustration now released into sound. He thought of every staff lounge whisper, every parent who doubted his capability, every student who had overheard that doubt and repeated it. He thought of Richard, smug and sure, treating him as a tool to garnish a meeting. And he poured it all into the strings, note after note like a flood that refused to be dammed. The sound shifted again, softening into something tender. It was not weakness. It was memory. He played for the children who had thanked him in shaky handwriting, for the student who had once told him, "You're the first teacher who believed I could do this." He played for the ancestors whose songs had been stolen, whose talents had been demanded without acknowledgement. He played for every unspoken wound, every hidden triumph. And as the final note rang, long and trembling, silence followed. Not the awkward silence of boredom or confusion, but the silence that comes when words cannot intrude, when no one dares to break what has been created. The bow hung in the air for a moment before Malcolm lowered it. He opened his eyes. The parents stared, motionless. The children stared. Even Richard, his face pale, couldn't disguise that he had underestimated what he had unleashed. For a heartbeat, the entire room seemed caught in suspension. Then a sound broke it. Not applause, not cheers, but the scrape of a chair. A woman in the front row leaned forward, her eyes wide, her hand pressed against her chest. She was striking, dressed in tailored silk, her diamond necklace catching the light. Eleanor Whitmore, one of the wealthiest parents in the district, known for her cutting remarks and air of superiority. Her reputation preceded her. She was a board donor, the kind of person Richard always catered to with unflinching deference. But now she wasn't whispering to her peers, or smirking in judgment. She was staring at Malcolm as if seeing a ghost. "I know that piece," she said suddenly, her voice trembling, louder than she intended. The room turned toward her. Malcolm blinked, confused. The melody he had played wasn't written. It had been born from his heart, shaped by memory and pain. You've played that before," Eleanor whispered, her eyes narrowing. "Years ago. I've heard it. I've heard you." The crowd shifted uneasily, murmurs breaking the silence. Richard frowned, glancing from Eleanor to Malcolm. Malcolm shook his head slowly. "I've never performed this for anyone here. Tonight was the first." Eleanor leaned further, her voice sharper now. Urgent. "No, you played it at Carnegie, didn't you? Or Lincoln Center. Somewhere. I was there. I heard this exact phrasing. You." She stopped, realizing her words carried too much weight, revealing too much of her own obsession with social performance and recognition. Malcolm's brow furrowed, the bow still in his hand. He had never performed in such venues. His life had not allowed it. The parents looked between them, confusion mounting. Some whispered, "What is she talking about? Carnegie? Lincoln Center?" Eleanor straightened, regaining composure, but her eyes remained fixed on him. Her tone hardened, as though covering vulnerability with mockery. "Well, wherever it was, you played like a professional. Strange, isn't it, that someone with that kind of talent ended up teaching math?" The remark landed like a dagger, cloaked in curiosity but steeped in condescension. The parents shifted again, sensing the sting beneath her words. Richard seized the moment, his smile returning, thin and manipulative. "Exactly," he said, rising from his seat. "A shame, isn't it? All that talent, wasted in a classroom. But tonight, at least, we've all had the pleasure." He gestured toward Malcolm, as though closing the performance, as though reclaiming control. But Eleanor didn't sit back. She stayed leaned forward, her gaze sharp, dissecting Malcolm in a way that felt intrusive, as if she had recognized something deeper, something she couldn't quite name, but wasn't willing to let go of. Malcolm held her stare, steady, unflinching. Inside, though, unease rippled. Why did she insist she had heard him before? Why did her certainty feel so dangerous? The room buzzed again, whispers rising, the spell of the music dissolving under Richard's manipulation and Eleanor's intrusion. Some parents clapped politely, unsure of what else to do. Others sat still, caught between admiration and the discomfort Eleanor had ignited. Malcolm lowered the violin slowly, his mind racing. He had silenced them with music, but now something new was stirring, something beyond his control. Eleanor leaned back at last, but her eyes never left him. She whispered, almost to herself, but loud enough for those nearby to hear, "It's impossible, but it's him." The words rippled through the crowd, planting seeds of suspicion, curiosity, danger. Malcolm placed the violin back in its case, his hand lingering on the wood. He had entered the evening expecting humiliation, but instead he had commanded the room. Yet somehow, in that triumph, a new threat had been born, one he hadn't foreseen. The gym was no longer just a meeting. It was a stage, and someone in the audience had recognized him in a way that could change everything. The gymnasium had not yet settled after Malcolm's performance, when Eleanor Whitmore's words continued to linger like a sour perfume. "It's him," she had whispered, her disbelief cutting through the applause. Parents leaned toward one another, murmuring, speculating. Richard Calloway tried to regain control, smiling as though nothing unusual had happened, but the undercurrent in the room had shifted. Malcolm sat at the side of the stage, violin case closed now, his jaw tight. Eleanor's gaze never left him. It was unsettling, the way she stared, not with admiration, but with recognition mixed with judgment, as if she had glimpsed a secret he hadn't shared. Eleanor stood, her silk scarf falling from one shoulder, her presence commanding even without the microphone. "You all heard it," she said, her voice carrying with the sharpness of entitlement. "That wasn't just a teacher fumbling through an instrument. That was artistry. That was professional." Some parents nodded. Others hesitated, sensing the trap in her words. She turned her eyes back on Malcolm. "Tell me, Mr. Wright, did you study formally? At Juilliard, perhaps? Or did you hide it all these years, burying your talent in the walls of this school?" Her tone carried both admiration and accusation, as though his dedication to teaching were somehow shameful. Malcolm opened his mouth to respond, but Richard quickly interjected, trying to laugh it off. "Now, Eleanor, let's not interrogate him. He gave us a beautiful moment. That should be enough." But Eleanor wasn't finished. She turned, scanning the room, until her eyes locked on a figure at the back of the gym. The janitor, Daniel Brooks. Daniel had been cleaning up after the event, quietly wheeling a mop bucket, keeping to the shadows as he always did. He was a tall black man, in his late 30s, shoulders broad, his posture careful, reserved. To most of the parents, he was invisible, a fixture of the building rather than a person. Eleanor's smile curved, cold and deliberate. "Well, if we're showcasing hidden talents tonight, perhaps we should see if others among us have gifts worth sharing." Her words dripped with condescension. She pointed toward Daniel. "You there. Don't you ever touch that piano." The crowd turned, eyes following her gesture. Daniel froze, his hand tightening on the mop handle. He glanced at the old upright piano sitting against the far wall of the gym, a piece of furniture rarely used, half forgotten. His eyes flickered with something unreadable before he quickly shook his head. Eleanor laughed, the sound sharp. "Of course not. Why would you? You clean floors. You don't play Chopin." The words landed with the cruelty of a whip. Some parents chuckled nervously, unsure whether to join her derision or stay silent. Others looked away, uncomfortable. Malcolm's chest clenched, rage building, but he stayed still, watching Daniel. Eleanor stepped closer, her voice louder now, deliberately theatrical. "But let's make this interesting. I'll make you a wager." She placed one manicured hand on the piano, her diamonds catching the gym lights. "If you can sit down right now and play something worthy, something that shows us real artistry, I'll marry you myself." The crowd erupted in shocked laughter. It wasn't humor, not truly. It was spectacle. Parents whispered furiously, some gasping, others giggling as though it were an elaborate joke staged for their amusement. Daniel's face hardened, but he didn't move. His silence seemed to amuse Eleanor even more. She leaned back, raising her chin. "That's what I thought. A janitor can mop floors, but he can't command music. Talent like Mr. Wright's is rare. People like you," her eyes raked Daniel's frame with disdain, "don't have it." The cruelty in her words struck Malcolm like a physical blow. He gripped the edge of his chair, his knuckles whitening. He knew what this was. The same erasure, the same reduction, now amplified into open humiliation. Eleanor wasn't merely mocking Daniel. She was reminding everyone present where she believed he belonged. For a long moment, Daniel didn't respond. His gaze was lowered, his expression unreadable. The parents' laughter began to fade into uneasy silence, the ugliness of Eleanor's words hanging too heavy in the air. Finally, Daniel lifted his eyes. They were calm, but behind them burned a fire that startled even Malcolm. His voice, when he spoke, was low, steady. "You want me to play?" he asked. Eleanor tilted her head, smirking. "If you dare." Daniel released the mop handle. The bucket sloshed as it rolled slightly. Forgotten. He walked slowly toward the piano, his footsteps echoing against the gym floor. Parents craned their necks, some whispering that this was madness, others watching with morbid fascination. Malcolm's pulse quickened. He hadn't expected this. He had known Daniel for years. Quiet, efficient, respectful, but he had never seen him like this. As Daniel approached the piano, Eleanor called out one last jab. And remember, if you impress me, I'll keep my word. You'll have the honor of saying you married Eleanor Whitmore. Though of course that's as impossible as you playing anything worth hearing. Her laughter rippled again, but weaker now, cracks of discomfort showing as the cruelty registered. Daniel reached the piano. He stood for a moment, his hand resting on the wood, as if weighing the decision. The gym was silent, except for the faint creak of the bench, as he pulled it back and sat down. He placed his hands on the keys. The parents leaned forward, waiting for a stumble, a failure, the confirmation of Eleanor's mockery. But Daniel didn't falter. He closed his eyes, inhaled slowly, and pressed down. The first chord rang out, full and resonant, filling the gym with a sound that silenced even Eleanor's smirk. His fingers moved again, and then again, fluid, sure, not hesitant. A melody began to form, rich and layered, as though the old piano had been waiting for him all along. Gasps broke the silence. Parents exchanged shocked glances. Some covered their mouths, unable to hide their disbelief. Daniel's hands danced across the keys, not with mechanical precision, but with soul. His music was alive, carrying a story that no one in that gym had imagined he could tell. It was not the tentative playing of a novice, nor the stiff performance of someone rehearsed for applause. It was mastery, raw, unpolished but undeniable. Malcolm's eyes widened, his breath catching. He understood instantly. Daniel had hidden this. All these years, the man they passed by with barely a nod had carried within him a gift, as profound as any he had ever known. Eleanor's face froze, the color draining. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. Her mockery had collapsed, stripped away by the undeniable truth resonating from the piano. The melody swelled, filling every corner of the gym. Children sat slack-jawed, parents leaned forward, and Richard for once had no words. Daniel's eyes opened briefly, locking with Malcolm's. In that look was an unspoken recognition. They both knew what it was to be dismissed, reduced, underestimated. But tonight, on this stage, neither of them had chosen. They were no longer invisible. The music rose higher, then softened, then lingered in a final chord that seemed to hang in the air long after his fingers left the keys. Silence followed. Stunned, reverent. Daniel stood slowly, his expression calm, his chest rising and falling steadily. He turned from the piano, his gaze sweeping the room. Eleanor's eyes burned, not with triumph but with something closer to fear. She had made a bet to humiliate him. Instead, he had turned the spotlight back on her, exposing her cruelty to everyone present. And in that silence, the moment stretched, heavy, fragile, ready to shatter. Daniel took one slow step forward, his eyes locked on Eleanor, the quiet fire in them unmistakable. The gymnasium was still vibrating with the echo of Daniel's final chord when silence settled over the room. For a long moment, no one moved. Parents stared at him, mouths slightly open, as though unsure whether they had truly witnessed what they had just heard. Daniel stood near the piano, tall and calm, but his hands betrayed him. They trembled faintly, the way a man's hands tremble after carrying too much weight for too long. He did not bask in the stunned attention. Instead, he seemed almost uneasy, as though his secret had been ripped into the light against his will. Malcolm, sitting at the edge of the stage, understood that unease instantly. Daniel's performance hadn't been a display of ego. It had been survival, memory, and truth forced through keys that had waited too long. The parents, though, were hungry for explanation. A woman in the second row whispered sharply to her husband, "How does a janitor play like that?" Another muttered, "That wasn't luck. That was something else." Eleanor Whitmore, however, refused to yield. Her posture stiffened, her smirk returning, though it wavered under the weight of what she had seen. "Well," she said loudly, reclaiming the room, "that was surprising. But perhaps a trick, nothing more. Anyone can memorize a piece if they tinker long enough." Her words cut through the awe, injecting doubt like poison. Some parents shifted uncomfortably, nodding slightly, as if reassured by her dismissal. It was easier to believe that Daniel's talent was a fluke than to admit they had overlooked someone extraordinary because of the uniform he wore. Malcolm clenched his fists beneath the table. He wanted to speak, to defend Daniel, but he held back. He knew Daniel's story was not his to tell. And then, Almost as if sensing the question on every face, Daniel did something he rarely did. My father, he began, his voice deep steady, was a construction worker. My mother worked nights at a diner. Money was always short, but they found a way to buy me a second-hand piano when I was 8 years old. It was cracked, some keys stuck, but it was enough. I practiced every day, teaching myself from library books, from cassette tapes I played until they broke. The room leaned forward. Even the children who had once mocked Malcolm's violin were wide-eyed, listening. Daniel's eyes unfocused slightly, as if remembering. By the time I was 12, I was playing pieces no one believed I had learned by ear. A teacher from the neighborhood church noticed me, gave me lessons when he could. He told me I had something rare, something worth protecting. He said if I worked hard enough, I might earn a place at a conservatory one day. Eleanor rolled her eyes, but Daniel continued, unshaken. When I was 17, I was offered a scholarship audition at a major music school. I prepared for months, working nights at a grocery store to cover the bus fare to New York. The day of the audition, I left early, carrying my music in a folder I had guarded, like it was gold. His jaw tightened, but I never made it inside. Security stopped me at the doors. They looked at my clothes, at my skin, and assumed I was lost, or worse. I explained, again and again, but they laughed, said this isn't for you. By the time I convinced them I was there to audition, my slot was gone. Gasps rippled through the room. A few parents shifted uncomfortably, unable to deny the sting of recognition in his words. They had seen doors close quietly for people like Daniel, doors they themselves had never realized were locked. Daniel's voice grew quieter. I came home empty. My father tried to console me, but he was sick by then. Cancer took him before I finished high school. My mother worked herself to exhaustion, and I worked alongside her. Music couldn't pay the bills. Dreams couldn't keep the lights on, so I put the piano aside. He paused, his gaze dropping. I became what was available. A janitor, a handyman, a man who cleaned floors so others could stand on them without noticing who made them shine. I told myself it was temporary, but years passed. Every time I touched a piano, the ache grew worse, so I stopped touching one at all. Silence gripped the gym. Parents who had once looked through Daniel now looked at him. Really looked. His words were not polished like Malcolm's. They were rough, unvarnished, but they struck harder because of it. Malcolm felt his throat tighten. He had known Daniel only as the quiet man who nodded politely in the halls, who fixed broken desks without complaint. He had never imagined this past, this buried brilliance. Daniel exhaled slowly, his eyes sweeping the crowd. So yes, Mrs. Whitmore, I can play. But not because I had every door open to me, because I learned to force open the few that weren't locked tight. And when those were closed too, I kept the music here. He tapped his chest, inside where no one could take it from me. The parents sat stunned. A few nodded in quiet respect. Others looked down, ashamed. But Eleanor, unwilling to lose control, laughed suddenly, sharp, loud, dismissive. The sound shattered the reverent silence like glass breaking. Oh, how tragic, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. A poor boy with a piano, stopped by cruel fate. A sad little tale. But let's not be dramatic. You're a janitor now. That's reality. Perhaps you should be grateful you had even a chance at all. Her laughter echoed, cruel and cutting. A few parents chuckled weakly, trying to align themselves with her power. But most sat still, the discomfort thick. Malcolm's stomach turned. The dismissal was not just aimed at Daniel's past, it was aimed at every black child who dared to dream bigger than the world allowed. Daniel didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on Eleanor, calm but unyielding. The quiet fire that had guided him to the piano bench still burned. And as Eleanor smirked, assuming she had won, assuming he would shrink back into silence, Daniel stepped closer to the piano again. The crowd held its breath. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, mocking. What's this? Do you actually dare to try again? Surely you wouldn't. Her laughter grew louder, filling the gym. She believed he wouldn't touch it again, that the humiliation had ended the show. But Daniel's hand hovered above the keys, steady, ready. Daniel lowered himself onto the piano bench once more. The gymnasium was thick with tension, half the audience expecting him to falter, the other half holding its breath. His broad hands hovered over the keys, not yet touching them. They trembled faintly, but not from fear. It was the tremor of a man holding back a storm. Across the room, Eleanor Whitmore's mocking laughter still hung in the air. She sat back in her chair with calculated ease, her diamond necklace glinting under the fluorescent lights. "Don't strain yourself," she called out, her voice light but cutting. "No one expects miracles from a man with a mop." The words burned through the gym. A ripple of discomfort passed through the audience. Some parents chuckled weakly, trying to align themselves with her power, but most sat stiffly, their gazes fixed on Daniel. Malcolm's fists clenched under the table. He wanted to shout, to defend Daniel, but something in the janitor's posture told him not to. Daniel didn't need saving. He was about to save himself. Daniel inhaled, then placed his hands firmly on the keys. For a moment, he was still. Then the music began. The first notes were soft, tentative, like whispers in a quiet room, but within seconds, they swelled into something fierce, unstoppable. His fingers moved with a precision that came not from privilege or polish, but from years of hidden practice, from nights when music was his only solace. The melody struck hard, powerful, yet every chord carried grace. The gym was transformed. The squeak of sneakers, the rustle of papers, the hum of fluorescent lights, all vanished beneath the sound. Parents leaned forward instinctively, as though pulled by invisible strings. The children who had once mocked fell silent, their eyes wide. Daniel wasn't playing for Eleanor. He wasn't playing for the parents, or even for Malcolm. He was playing for himself. For the boy who had been turned away at the conservatory door. For the son who had worked double shifts to support his mother. For the man who had swallowed indignities until his throat burned with silence. Each note was defiance, each chord a refusal to be erased. Eleanor's smirk faltered. She shifted in her seat, her hand tightening around her scarf. The confidence in her expression melted, as the music wrapped around her, undeniable and unrelenting. She had wanted a spectacle. Instead, she was witnessing an unveiling. Malcolm's chest tightened as he watched. Daniel's music carried echoes of his own violin performance earlier that night. Not in melody, but in spirit. Two men, dismissed and diminished, were carving truth into the air with instruments no one had expected them to wield with such power. The parents, who moments before had laughed, now sat spellbound. One mother covered her mouth, tears welling. A father leaned forward, his face pale, as if ashamed of the casual jokes he'd made minutes earlier. The children, restless, distracted, easily amused, sat frozen, their attention captured in a way no lecture ever could. Daniel's fingers flew faster, the melody shifting into something almost furious. It wasn't reckless, it was purposeful, deliberate, like a controlled fire. He struck the keys with intensity, but never harshness. The gym's walls seemed to shake with the resonance, every note carrying weight that reached even those who tried not to listen. Richard Calloway, seated at the administration table, shifted uneasily. He had thought Eleanor's stunt would turn the room back in his favor, redirecting attention from Malcolm's bold defiance. But now he saw the opposite unfolding. The janitor was commanding the room with more authority than he had ever wielded. Daniel closed his eyes, as the music softened, dipping into something almost prayerful. His hands slowed, each note deliberate, aching. He thought of his father's hands, calloused from years of construction, and his mother's weary smile after night shifts. He thought of the locked doors, the silent humiliations, the years spent pushing a mop while the music inside him screamed to be heard, and with every note he released that weight. The melody rose again, brighter now, defiant but not bitter. It was triumphant, the sound of a man refusing to be small. The gymnasium pulsed with it, parents' chests rising and falling with the rhythm, students sitting straighter as if pulled upward by the sound. Finally, the piece drew toward its end. Daniel's hands slowed, the chords deepening into something final, resolute. The last note lingered, long and haunting, filling every corner of the room before fading into silence. The silence that followed was thunderous. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not even the creak of a chair. It was the silence of a room that had been shaken, a silence no one dared break. Daniel lifted his hands from the keys and sat back, breathing heavily, sweat shining on his brow. He didn't look at Eleanor. He didn't need to. The room stayed frozen, suspended between disbelief and awe. Parents exchanged glances, their eyes wide, their mouths slightly open. Children looked at one another as if asking silently, "Did you see that? Did you hear that?" And then from the back of the gym, a sound emerged. Clap. Slow, measured, deliberate, All eyes turned. A man near the exit stood, his hands coming together again. Clap, clap, clap. His expression was unreadable, but his applause carried weight. It was not polite, not mocking. It was acknowledgement. The sound cut through the silence, each clap echoing like a challenge, like the opening of something none of them had expected. Malcolm's eyes narrowed, watching. Who was this man? Eleanor turned sharply, her expression tight, her eyes darting between Daniel and the figure clapping at the back. For the first time that evening, her confidence cracked completely. Daniel remained seated at the piano, his chest rising and falling, his eyes locked forward. He didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't respond to the applause. He had given everything in those notes, and now he waited. The rest of the gym remained in stunned silence. Parents sat frozen, children stared, and Richard looked unsettled, his authority unraveling thread by thread. The man continued clapping, slow and steady, his footsteps echoing as he began to walk forward. The man's slow clapping echoed through the gymnasium, like a drumbeat. Daniel remained seated at the piano, sweat glistening on his forehead, chest rising and falling with steady breaths. Parents turned in their seats, eyes darting between the pianist and the stranger at the back of the room. Malcolm felt his pulse quicken. Whoever this man was, his deliberate applause had broken the spell of silence. Eleanor's smirk had already collapsed into something taut, uncertain, and Richard Calloway, sitting stiffly at the table, looked as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. The stranger reached the middle of the gym and stopped, folding his arms, his voice carried with an even authority. "That wasn't a trick," he said firmly. "That was mastery." The parents buzzed, whispers rising like a sudden storm. Mastery. The word hung heavy. They couldn't dismiss what they had seen, though some tried. One mother muttered, "But he's the janitor." Another whispered, "Where did he learn to play like that?" Richard sprang to his feet, clapping his hands together once, loud and sharp. "All right, everyone," he said with forced cheer. "That was entertaining. A nice diversion. Let's not get carried away." His voice faltered slightly, but he pressed on, smiling thinly. After all, talent can be a parlor trick, a hobby. What matters is the work people are hired to do. The dismissal hit the room like cold water. Parents stiffened. Daniel's jaw tightened, though he remained still. Malcolm's stomach turned. Richard wasn't just brushing aside the performance. He was stripping it of dignity, shoving it back into a box labeled less than. But the parents weren't entirely buying it. Murmurs grew louder. Some nodded in agreement with Richard, but others frowned, their eyes returning to Daniel with new respect. A father in the third row spoke up. "With all due respect, Principal Calloway, that didn't look like a trick. That looked like something special." Richard's smile tightened, his voice sharpening. "Mr. O'Connell, please. Let's remember, this is a school meeting, not a talent show. We're here to discuss our children's education, not indulge sideshows." His eyes flicked toward Daniel, with cold precision. The word sideshow rippled through the crowd, cruel in its intent. Daniel looked down at the keys, his hands folded in his lap. Malcolm stood suddenly, his voice calm but cutting. "With respect, sir, that wasn't a sideshow. That was truth." The gym shifted again, gasps and murmurs spreading. Richard's eyes narrowed, a flash of anger breaking through his carefully maintained composure. "Sit down, Malcolm," he hissed, though his voice carried. "You've already overstepped tonight." Malcolm didn't move. His gaze stayed on Daniel, steady and supportive. The quiet solidarity was louder than any defense. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice brittle. "Really, this is absurd. So he can play a little piano. What does it matter? He's still the janitor. Let's not pretend otherwise." A few parents nodded, clinging to her authority, but others looked uncomfortable, shifting in their chairs. The room was no longer aligned in easy agreement. It was fracturing. Richard sensed it too, and panic flickered behind his eyes. He raised his voice, trying to regain control. "Everyone, let's keep our perspective. This display was amusing, yes, but let's not elevate it beyond what it is. Our children need structure, discipline, results, not theatrics." But his words sounded weaker now, defensive. Parents whispered, heads shaking. The stranger who had clapped crossed his arms and said evenly, "If discipline and results are all you value, Principal Calloway, you've already failed to recognize what inspiration looks like." The line landed like a strike. A few parents even murmured in agreement. Richard's face flushed red. Malcolm saw it, the fury boiling beneath Richard's polished exterior. For years, Richard had relied on charm and authority to keep the room in his grip. But now that grip was slipping. The janitor he had likely never truly noticed had become the center of the evening, his music impossible to dismiss. And worse, Malcolm had stood his ground earlier, undermining Richard's control. Richard pounded the table once with his fist, the sound jolting. Enough, he snapped. This meeting is about parents and their children, not about employees who don't know their place. The words silenced the room, not with agreement, but with shock. Don't know their place. The phrase reverberated, ugly, unmistakable. Parents exchanged glances. Some gasped audibly. The mask Richard had worn so carefully had cracked wide open. Daniel rose slowly from the bench. His movements were calm, deliberate. He didn't look at Richard. He didn't need to. The dignity in his posture was its own defiance. Malcolm stepped down from the stage, closing the space between them. For the first time all evening, the two men stood side by side, silent but united. The parents watched, many caught between shame and awe. A murmur rose again, louder now, harder to control. Eleanor shifted uncomfortably, her smirk long gone. She tugged at her necklace, her eyes darting as though calculating her next move. And then from the back of the gym came a sound that would change the course of the evening entirely. A chair scraped against the floor. A young woman with a notepad and press badge pinned to her blazer stood up, pulling a phone from her bag. She had been quiet all evening, unnoticed amid the sea of parents. Now she raised her phone, its camera lens pointed directly at the stage. Click. The red light blinked on. I think the public might want to see this, she said calmly, her voice carrying. The gym froze. Parents turned, wide-eyed. Richard's face drained of color. Daniel and Malcolm exchanged a glance, both realizing, in that instant, that this night had just left the walls of the school. The journalist's phone recorded steadily, the red light blinking like an unblinking eye. The atmosphere inside the gym shifted. Suddenly every word, every expression, every silence was no longer confined to four walls. It was being captured, preserved, and destined to travel far beyond Jefferson Middle School. Richard Calloway noticed it first. His face blanched, and his voice lost its steady authority. Turn that off, he demanded, pointing sharply. This is a private meeting. You can't. But the young woman didn't flinch. I'm a reporter, she said evenly. And what I'm seeing here is very much in the public's interest. Her camera stayed trained on the stage. Parents shifted, uneasy. Some whispered, some nodded in approval. Malcolm stood still, his chest tight. Daniel remained near the piano, shoulders squared, dignity radiating even in silence. Eleanor turned sharply in her chair, glaring at the reporter, as though sheer will could erase the footage. The rest of the meeting sputtered out after that. Richard tried to regain control, tried to shuffle the agenda forward, but no one cared anymore. Eyes kept returning to Daniel, to Malcolm, to the piano that had transformed the evening. Every attempt at normalcy failed. By the time chairs scraped and parents filed out, the story had already begun to leave the room. That night, the video hit the internet. It started small, uploaded to a local news outlet's site, then shared on social media by parents who couldn't stop replaying what they had witnessed. The footage captured everything. Malcolm's speech, Daniel's music, Richard's furious words, employees who don't know their place, and the sharp cruelty of Eleanor's mockery. Within hours, the video spread. On Facebook, comments flooded beneath shaky cell phone clips. This broke me in half. How could they treat him like that? That music, my God, that music. On Twitter, hashtags began trending. Main play for truth, janitor genius, hidden excellence. Some users stitched the video into threads about systemic racism, about how black talent was too often ignored, buried, or mocked until forced into the light. Others clipped the final minutes of Daniel's performance, setting it to captions that read, "This man is more than his job title." By morning, millions had watched. Malcolm woke to a phone buzzing non-stop on his nightstand. He rubbed his eyes, bleary from too little sleep, and saw dozens of missed calls and hundreds of notifications. His name was everywhere. His students had tagged him in posts. Strangers had filled his inbox with messages of gratitude and outrage. He sat on the edge of his bed, scrolling through comments. Malcolm Wright, the teacher who spoke truth when others wanted silence. Protect this man at all costs. How many more teachers are we overlooking because of systemic bias? But not all the messages were kind. There were others too. Ungrateful troublemaker. Just do your job. Race baiter. The venom was familiar, but sharper now with the force of the internet behind it. Still, he felt something shift inside him. For once, his dignity hadn't been swallowed. It had been witnessed, amplified. Daniel's morning was even more surreal. He had returned to his small apartment after the meeting, convinced that Eleanor's mockery would drown out whatever he had managed to play. But when he opened his phone, the flood nearly knocked him back. Videos of him at the piano had been shared thousands, then millions of times. His name, Daniel Brooks, was now attached to words like genius, virtuoso, and undiscovered talent. He scrolled through disbelief. Messages poured in, strangers thanking him for his courage, musicians praising his skill, children writing, "I want to play like you." But along with admiration came exploitation. Talent agencies sent DMs, some genuine, some predatory, old acquaintances from his past. People who had once ignored him suddenly remembered his number. Even distant relatives he hadn't heard from in years appeared, congratulating him. Daniel sat at his kitchen table, the glow of the phone lighting his tired face. He felt overwhelmed, exposed. For years, music had been his secret refuge. Now it was the world's spectacle. He set the phone down, staring at his calloused hands. Could he carry this sudden weight, or would it crush him the same way doors had slammed in his youth? The debate raged online. Cable news picked up the story. Some anchors called it an inspiring reminder that genius can be found anywhere. Others turned it into a culture war, sneering that it was overblown or politically weaponized. Editorials appeared overnight. One op-ed in a national paper read, "Daniel Brooks is not an anomaly. He is the proof of how much brilliance we bury beneath prejudice." Another, more cynical, declared, "A janitor playing piano doesn't erase the fact that schools need leaders, not distractions."
Oh.
Podcasts dissected the clip. Talk radio hosts mocked or praised it depending on their leanings. Everywhere the same question repeated: how many doors remain locked to people like Daniel? Malcolm walked into school the next morning. Under a storm of flashing cameras, news vans lined the street, reporters jostling for quotes. He kept his head high, but inside, anxiety gnawed at him. He had not wanted fame. He had wanted respect. Students cheered as he entered, some clapping, others holding up phones to record him walking down the hall. For the first time, they weren't laughing or whispering. They looked at him as though he were something larger, something more than a teacher. But Malcolm's stomach twisted. He wasn't sure that was good. Admiration was as dangerous as dismissal when it stripped away humanity and turned him into symbol instead of man. Daniel, meanwhile, slipped into the building quietly, avoiding cameras where he could. Yet even he couldn't escape. A group of 8th graders spotted him near the supply closet and erupted into applause, shouting, "Play it again, Mr. Brooks." He smiled faintly, nodding, but his eyes betrayed fatigue. He had been invisible for so long. Now the spotlight burned hot. By evening, the video had been translated into multiple languages, circulating on international platforms. Clips of Daniel's performance appeared on television in Europe, Asia, and South America. Music critics blogged about him. Some speculated he was self-taught. Others guessed at a hidden conservatory background. Through it all, Daniel stayed quiet. He ignored most calls, most emails, unsure of what to trust. But then, as he sat in the quiet of his apartment, his phone buzzed again. This time, the message was different. It was from a name he recognized, though he scarcely believed it could be real. "Daniel, my name is Victor Laurent. I direct the New York Philharmonic. I watched your video. I would like to meet you. Call me." Daniel's hands shook as he read the message again and again, the words blurring. The same city that had once turned him away now called him back. But was it too late, or was this the chance that had always been meant for him? Daniel Brooks stood in front of the glass doors of Lincoln Hall, his reflection staring back at him. The towering building loomed above, sleek and polished, a world away from the scuffed linoleum and mop buckets that had defined most of his adult life. His palms were damp, his chest tight, and for the first time since playing in that school gym, fear gripped him. The message from Victor Laurent, the renowned conductor of the New York Philharmonic, still felt unreal. "I would like to meet you." Just 6 words, but they had carried Daniel here, to the threshold of a place he once believed was forever locked. Inside, polished marble floors gleamed, The smell of varnished wood and expensive cologne lingered. Young musicians in tailored coats rushed by with instrument cases, their voices filled with easy confidence. Daniel adjusted his plain button-down shirt, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked. His shoes were clean but old, his jacket worn thin. He felt the sting of being invisible again, but this time in a space where invisibility wasn't an option. A receptionist greeted him with professional warmth. "Mr. Brooks? Maestro Laurent is expecting you. This way, please." Her words startled him. Mr. Brooks. No one had called him that outside of a school hallway in years. He followed her, each step echoing like a test. The rehearsal hall was vast, filled with rows of empty seats. At the center sat a gleaming Steinway grand piano, its black surface reflecting the bright overhead lights. Daniel's breath caught. This was no battered upright in a school gym. This was the kind of piano he had once only seen in magazines. Victor Laurent emerged from the shadows of the stage. He was tall, silver-haired, dressed in a dark suit that carried authority without effort. His reputation preceded him, demanding, exacting, but visionary. He extended a "Mr. Brooks," Laurent said, his French accent sharp yet melodic. "I am very glad you came." Daniel hesitated, then shook his hand. "Thank you for inviting me." Laurent studied him for a moment, his eyes piercing. "Your video, it moved me. The way you played, it was not technique alone, it was truth, and truth is what music demands." Daniel nodded, unsure how to respond. Compliments were foreign. Dismissal had always been more familiar. Laurent gestured to the piano. "Play for me. Whatever you choose." Daniel froze. The words echoed through him like a test he hadn't studied for. Whatever you choose. The freedom terrified him. He walked to the bench, sat down, and placed his hands on the cool keys. The weight of years pressed on him. He remembered being 17, turned away from an audition he never got to give. He remembered the mocking faces of security guards who told him, "This isn't for you." He remembered the long nights scrubbing floors, convincing himself that his dream had been foolish. Now, here he was, with a chance he had thought gone forever. But his hands would not move. His chest constricted, and for a terrifying moment, he thought he would fail again, frozen by the ghosts of his past. Laurent's voice broke the silence, firm but not unkind. "Do not play for me. Do not play for them. Play for the boy who first touched the keys." Daniel closed his eyes. He inhaled deeply. Slowly, he began. The first notes trembled, uneven. But then, as his fingers found the melody, strength returned. He played a piece he had never written down, one born from memory. His father's laughter, his mother's weary smile, the echoes of hymns sung in the neighborhood church. Each chord carried weight, not polished perfection but lived experience. Laurent stood still, his expression unreadable. Daniel's fingers moved faster, confidence building. The music swelled, carrying the ache of locked doors and the triumph of finally stepping through one. His hands no longer trembled. They danced. The sound filled the hall, echoing against walls built for brilliance. When he stopped, the silence was thick. Daniel looked up, heart pounding, sweat dampening his shirt. Laurent exhaled slowly, his eyes gleaming. "You have something rare. Not just skill, soul. I cannot teach that. No conservatory can." Daniel's throat tightened. "But I've had no training, no pedigree. I'm a janitor." Laurent's gaze hardened. "You are a musician. That is what matters. But the world will not be kind. They will question you, belittle you, because you do not fit the mold. Are you ready for that?" The question hung heavy. Daniel swallowed. He thought of Eleanor's laughter, of Richard's dismissal, of years spent cleaning as though his life had no other value. He thought of Malcolm, standing up in that gym with quiet dignity. "I'm ready," Daniel said finally, though his voice trembled. Laurent nodded once. "Then we will see." Word of his audition leaked quickly. The journalist who had filmed the school meeting hinted at it in a follow-up article, and soon speculation swirled online. Supporters cheered. "He's finally getting the chance he deserves." Critics sneered. "A viral video doesn't make you a professional." Daniel avoided the noise, focusing on the piano. Laurent invited him back for a private audition before a small panel. Conductors, musicians, donors. It was the kind of test that could open doors or close them forever. On the night of the audition, Daniel walked backstage, his hands damp, his stomach tight. He heard the low hum of voices beyond the curtain, felt the weight of anticipation pressing from the other side. Laurent approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Remember, they will look at you and see only what they expect. Do not let them define you. Show them who you are. Daniel nodded, but his chest constricted. He could hear laughter from the audience, polite, cultured, but it sent him back to every moment he had been dismissed. His legs felt heavy as he stepped onto the stage. The lights were blinding, the Steinway gleaming under their glare. He sat down, hands hovering above the keys, and then he froze. His vision blurred. The whispers of his past crowded in. This isn't for you. Know your place. Just a janitor. For a terrible moment, he thought he would fail. His hands wouldn't move. The silence stretched, and he could feel the audience shifting impatiently. Then, as he looked out into the crowd, his eyes caught on a face. Familiar. Steady. Malcolm Wright sat in the second row, his gaze fixed on Daniel, silent encouragement radiating. Something in that look broke the paralysis. Daniel inhaled sharply, placed his fingers on the keys, and prepared to play. The silence inside Lincoln Hall was suffocating. Daniel Brooks sat at the Steinway, hands poised above the keys, but frozen by the weight of memory. His chest heaved. The lights blinded him. The whispers of doubt pressed closer. This isn't for you. Know your place. And then in the blur of the audience he saw him. Malcolm Wright. Seated in the second row, leaning forward ever so slightly. His face was calm but resolute. His eyes locked on Daniel's. He didn't mouth words, didn't gesture. He simply was there, a quiet presence, steady as stone, carrying with it the weight of all the nights Daniel had been unseen. Daniel exhaled, a tremor leaving his body. His fingers touched the keys. And then he began to play. The first notes were soft, uncertain, but they found their shape quickly. A melody emerged, raw and haunting, echoing years of struggle. The audience hushed, leaning forward, caught by something they couldn't yet name. Daniel's music was not polished perfection. It was life uneven, jagged, swelling with grief and triumph. He played the memory of his father's laugh, the ache of his mother's tired hands, the sting of rejection outside the conservatory doors. He played the silence of nights spent alone, with a mop and bucket, humming melodies to keep from breaking. But threaded through all of it was something brighter, resilience, defiance, a refusal to disappear. Malcolm's eyes glistened as he listened. He recognized the language in Daniel's music, because he had spoken it himself on the violin. It was the sound of survival made beautiful, the sound of dignity refusing to bow. The panelists, seasoned musicians who had heard countless auditions, sat straighter, their pens stilled. One leaned forward, her lips parting slightly, as though trying to catch each note before it vanished. Daniel's hands moved faster, the melody climbing. It was as though he were tearing chains from his chest, hurling them into the keys. Every strike was precise but full of fire, shaking the hall. The piano thundered under his touch, not with chaos but with power. The audience was transfixed. Even those who had come skeptical, those who whispered that he was a viral gimmick, felt their certainty unravel. This was not a trick. This was not novelty. This was truth, undeniable and uncontainable. And then, just as suddenly, the music softened. His fingers slowed, the chords gentle, almost tender. It was a lullaby for the boy he once was, the boy who had been turned away, who had carried rejection like a scar. Daniel closed his eyes as he played, tears slipping down his cheeks unnoticed. The sound was fragile yet unbreakable, a voice whispering, "You were always enough." In the second row, Malcolm's throat tightened. He gripped the armrest of his chair, fighting the urge to weep openly. He thought of his students, of the countless young black children told in subtle and cruel ways that their dreams were too much, their worth too little. Tonight, here, Daniel was undoing those lies, note by note. The hall trembled as Daniel reached the final movement. His music swelled again, brighter, stronger, soaring. The melody no longer carried only pain. It carried freedom. Years of silence were breaking open, pouring into the room. When the last chord thundered and faded, the silence that followed was electric. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. Then, as if pulled by an unseen force, the audience rose. One by one, then all at once, they stood to their feet, applause erupting like a wave crashing against the walls. Cheers filled the hall, echoing, rising higher, demanding recognition for what they had just witnessed. Daniel sat motionless at the bench, his hands still trembling above the keys, his face wet with tears. He could barely comprehend the sound around him. Applause was something he had never allowed himself to imagine. The panelists clapped too, nodding at one another, astonished. Laurent, standing at the side of the stage, allowed the faintest smile to cross his usually stern face. Malcolm rose with the crowd, clapping hard, his chest swelling with pride. He caught Daniel's eye and nodded once, silently telling him, "You did it. They see you now." But amid the thunder of approval, there was one figure unmoved, Eleanor Whitmore, seated near the aisle, in the middle rows, her diamond necklace glittering under the lights. She remained still, her hands rested neatly in her lap, her chin lifted, her eyes sharp and unyielding. While the rest of the hall erupted in recognition, she sat motionless, refusing to stand, refusing to clap. Parents and patrons around her glanced, confused, but she did not flinch. Her lips curved into the faintest smirk, as if daring Daniel to think applause could erase her verdict. Daniel, catching sight of her, felt a jolt of cold run through him. Even as hundreds celebrated, her refusal landed like a blade. It reminded him of every locked door, every mocking laugh, every time excellence had been reduced to not enough. The ovation roared on, but Eleanor's silence cut through it like a whisper only he could hear. Daniel stood slowly, bowing his head to the audience. But his eyes, burning, flicked once more to Eleanor. She stared back, unmoving. And in that moment, he realized applause was not the end. Recognition could still be withheld. Some battles were not won with ovations. The ovation thundered on inside Lincoln Hall, but Eleanor Whitmore sat frozen in her chair, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her refusal to clap stood out like a wound against the rising tide of applause. Parents and patrons glanced at her uneasily, whispering, their eyes flicking between her still form and the stage where Daniel bowed, shaken but dignified. Her silence was deliberate, sharp as glass. It was her last weapon, the same one she had wielded all her life, the power to withhold recognition, to let her stillness erase what others celebrated. But this time, the air around her shifted. The crowd had changed. No one else was willing to join her in silence. A man behind her muttered, not quietly enough. Shameful. A woman 2 seats over whispered, after what she said at the school, and now this. Eleanor's jaw tightened. For the first time, she felt the weight of the stairs turning on her. On stage, Malcolm noticed it too. His applause slowed, his sharp eyes catching the cracks spreading through Eleanor's composure. He knew that arrogance built on cruelty could never withstand truth for long. Daniel's music had exposed her not just to him, but to everyone. The ovation faded gradually into murmurs. People turned to one another, voices low but pointed. The story of Eleanor's public bat back at the school had spread like wildfire in the weeks since the meeting. Now, watching her sit motionless while the hall shook with applause, those words were surfaced with venom. "If you can play this piano, I'll marry you." She had said it with mockery. But now, after Daniel's performance, the cruelty in those words became undeniable. A voice rose from the audience, an older man near the front. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his tone cold, "you demanded proof, and you were given more than you ever deserved. Why don't you stand?" The hall quieted again, all eyes snapping to her. Eleanor's face flushed, but she forced a thin smile. I was simply making a point, a challenge, nothing more. Surely we can all agree Mr. Brooks is talented." "But what?" Another voice cut in sharply. "You humiliated him in front of children, and now you sit in silence while he gives the performance of a lifetime? That's not a challenge. That's cruelty." The murmurs grew sharper. A tide of disapproval swelled, pressing in on Eleanor from every side. Her mask cracked further. Daniel, still at the piano, said nothing. He stood tall, his hands at his sides, letting the crowd's judgment wash over her. His silence was more powerful than any rebuke. Finally, Eleanor rose, slow and stiff. She lifted her chin, but her eyes betrayed her unease. "Fine," she said loudly. "You want truth. Here it is. Yes, I mocked him. Yes, I dared him. Because I knew the pain of failure myself." Gasps rippled through the hall. Her words tumbled out, sharper now, as though pulled from her despite herself. "When I was young, I trained as a pianist. My family paid for lessons, recitals, tutors. I had every advantage, every door opened. And yet, when I auditioned, when it mattered, I failed. Not once, Not twice, but over and over. I wasn't good enough. I wasn't chosen. Her voice cracked, the steel slipping. So I buried it. I married into money, into power, into everything I thought would erase that failure. And when I saw him, a janitor with a gift I could never master, it cut me open. She looked at Daniel now, her eyes glistening though her smile still fought to hold. I mocked you because I hated you, because you carried what I had lost. The hall was silent, stunned. Her confession was raw, shocking, yet it reeked of desperation, a last attempt to claw back dignity. Daniel's expression remained calm, but his eyes were steady, piercing. Eleanor laughed suddenly, brittle and sharp, as though laughing could glue her crumbling mask. So yes, I made a bet, a foolish, cruel bet, and you won. Congratulations. The audience bristled. Her attempt at sarcasm rang hollow, sour. Laurent stepped forward from the wings, his voice low but carrying. This is not about bets, Mrs. Whitmore. This is about dignity. You tried to take his away. Instead, you have revealed your own emptiness. Her cheeks flushed crimson. She turned toward the audience, searching for allies, but found only cold stares and murmured condemnation. The wealth and influence that had once insulated her now felt flimsy, fragile. Do you all hate me now? She demanded, her voice breaking, the arrogance collapsing into something small, frantic. Is that what you want? No one answered. The silence was heavier than any shouted rebuke. She turned back toward Daniel, her diamond necklace trembling against her chest. Her voice dropped, quieter now, almost pleading. Do you hate me now? The words cut through the hall, fragile, desperate, trembling with something she had never allowed herself to feel before. Vulnerability. Daniel's jaw tightened, his chest rising with the weight of the moment. He didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched, unbearable, every eye fixed on him. The hall held its breath. The applause in Lincoln Hall eventually ebbed, leaving behind a silence weighted not with dismissal but with reverence. Eleanor Whitmore's desperate question, "Do you hate me now?" hung unanswered in the air. Daniel Brooks, still at the piano, chose not to respond with words. His silence itself was a response, a refusal to grant her the power of defining the moment. Instead, he bowed once more to the audience, then stepped back, leaving Eleanor exposed in her seat. Her diamond necklace sparkled under the lights, but her authority had dulled. She sat hunched, eyes downcast, as the hall buzzed not with admiration for her wealth, but with recognition of Daniel's dignity. That night marked a turning point. The performance, the confession, and the tension in that hall spread far beyond the walls of Lincoln Hall. The journalist video captured not just music but truth, and the world demanded to see more. 2 weeks later, Jefferson Middle School looked different. Where once Malcolm Wright walked the halls under whispers of ridicule, now he was greeted with respect. Students who had mocked him before now lingered after class to ask about his violin, his courage, his words. Parents who once treated him as an accessory approached him with handshakes and apologies. It wasn't perfect. There were still side glances, still those who clung to prejudice in silence, but the weight of mockery had lifted. His classroom, once shadowed by gossip, now carried a hum of possibility. Daniel, too, had become a figure of reverence. The janitor who once passed unnoticed now walked with shoulders straighter. Students cheered when they saw him in the halls, some calling out, "Mr. Brooks, play for us again." He would smile faintly, shaking his head, promising, "Maybe another time." For him, music was no longer hidden, but neither was it a spectacle. It was his, and now the world's. A plaque appeared outside the auditorium door, in honor of Daniel Brooks and Malcolm Wright, who reminded us that dignity and truth are never parlor tricks. But celebration was only half the story. Beneath the praise, accountability stirred. The school board convened in emergency sessions after the video of Richard Calloway's words circulated. His declaration, "Employees who don't know their place," echoed across social media, dissected in op-eds and debated on talk shows. It was not just a slip of the tongue. It was evidence of a pattern too many recognized. Parents began to demand answers. Students carried protest signs, "Respect our teachers, dignity for all staff." The gym that had once held a humiliating meeting became the site of town halls filled with hard questions. Malcolm sat through those meetings quietly, speaking only when asked. He never raised his voice, never sought vengeance. But when asked what had hurt most, he answered simply, "It wasn't being asked to play. It was being told my worth was less than my work." The words spread just as Daniel's music had. Powerful, undeniable, uncontainable. Meanwhile, Daniel faced choices he had never imagined. Offers poured in from orchestras, recording studios and festivals. Victor Laurent kept his promise, inviting him to play again, not as a curiosity but as an artist. Daniel accepted cautiously, balancing opportunity with fear of exploitation. For every door that opened, he remembered the ones that had once been slammed shut. One evening, Malcolm visited Daniel in his small apartment. The violin rested on Malcolm's lap, the piano keys under Daniel's fingers. They played together quietly, not for an audience, not for applause, but for themselves. Two men, once mocked, now bound by the shared truth of their survival. When the final notes faded, Malcolm said softly, "We're not symbols, Daniel. We're men, and we deserve to be seen as such." Daniel nodded, eyes glistening, and maybe now they will. At school, life pressed on. Lessons resumed, bells rang, students laughed in the halls. But something had shifted. The children had seen their teacher stand, their janitor rise, and their principal stumble. The lesson had been larger than algebra or grammar. It was about worth, the kind no title, paycheck, or prejudice could erase. But beneath the hum of normalcy, a storm gathered. One morning, a crisp envelope arrived at the principal's office. Richard Calloway slid it open casually, expecting routine correspondence. His eyes scanned the letter once, then again, his face draining of color. It was from the Office of Civil Rights. An investigation had been opened. Formal, public, unavoidable. The letter detailed complaints of racial misconduct, citing video evidence and multiple testimonies. His words, his behavior, his pattern of dismissal, all under scrutiny. He crumpled the letter in his fist, sweat forming at his temple. For the first time, his polished shoes and silver hair could not protect him. The authority he had wielded like a weapon now hung by a thread. Across the hall, Malcolm taught his students. Unaware of the letter that trembled in Richard's hand, Daniel mopped quietly in the corridor. Though now students greeted him with nods of respect instead of ignoring him, life had found a new rhythm. But justice was coming, step by step, letter by letter. Richard folded the paper, slipping it into a drawer, his hands shaking. He looked out the window at the playground below. Children running free, laughter ringing. His career, his reputation, his carefully maintained mask, all of it now under threat. The letter's final line echoed in his mind. Failure to cooperate will result in disciplinary action up to and including removal. His jaw tightened. For the first time, Richard Calloway understood. The story was not his to control anymore. And the question lingered, heavier than ever. What would justice look like when it finally arrived? Too often, voices like Malcolm's and Daniel's are silenced, their worth reduced until the world decides to listen. But their fight isn't just theirs, it's ours. If you believe no one should ever be judged by the color of their skin or the job they hold, type yes in the comments.